Chapter 7 OF The Will and Direct Passions. Sect. I of Liberty and Necessity. We come now to explain the direct passions, or the impressions, which arise immediately from good or evil, from pain or pleasure. Of this kind are desire and aversion, grief and joy, hope and fear. Of all the immediate effects of pain and pleasure, there is none more remarkable than the will, and though properly speaking, it be not comprehended among the passions, yet as the full understanding of its nature and properties is necessary to the explanation of them, we shall here make it the subject of our inquiry. I desire it may be observed that by the will, I mean nothing but the internal impression we feel in, are conscious of, when we knowingly give rise to any new motion of our body, or new perception of our mind. This impression, like the preceding ones of pride and humility, love and hatred, it is impossible to define, and needless to describe any farther, for which reason we shall cut off all those definitions and distinctions with which philosophers are wont to perplex rather than dear up this question, and entering at first upon the subject, shall examine that long disputed question concerning liberty and necessity, which occurs so naturally in treating of the will. It is universally acknowledged that the operations of external bodies are necessary, and that in the communication of their motion, in their attraction and mutual cohesion, there are nor the least traces of indifference or liberty. Every object is determined by an absolute fate, to a certain degree and direction of its motion, and can no more depart from that precise line in which it moves, than it can convert itself into an angel, or spirit, or any superior substance. The actions, therefore, of matter are to be regarded as instances of necessary actions, and whatever is in this respect on the same footing with matter must be acknowledged to be necessary. That we may know whether this be the case with the actions of the mind, we shall begin with examining matter, and considering on what the idea of a necessity in its operations are founded, and why we conclude one body or action to be the infallible cause of another. It has been observed already that in no single instance the ultimate connection of any objects is discoverable, either by our senses or reason, and that we can never penetrate so far into the essence and construction of bodies as to perceive the principle on which their mutual influence depends. It is their constant union alone with which we are acquainted, and it is from the constant union the necessity arises. If objects had not an uniform and regular conjunction with each other, we should never arrive at any idea of cause and effect, and even after all, the necessity which enters into that idea is nothing but a determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant, and infer the existence of one from that of the other. Here, then, are two particulars which we are to consider as essential to necessity, viz., the constant union and the inference of the mind, and wherever we discover these we must acknowledge a necessity, as the actions of matter have no necessity but what is derived from these circumstances, and it is not by any insight into the essence of bodies we discover their connection. The absence of this insight, while the union and inference remain, will never, in any case, remove the necessity. It is the observation of the union which produces the inference, for which reason it might be thought sufficient, if we prove a constant union in the actions of the mind, in order to establish the inference, along with the necessity of these actions. But that I may bestow a greater force on my reasoning, I shall examine these particulars apart, and shall first prove from experience that our actions have a constant union with our motives, tempers, and circumstances, before I consider the inferences we draw from it. To this end a very slight and general view of the common course of human affairs will be sufficient. There is no light in which we can take them that does not confirm this principle. Whether we consider mankind according to the difference of sexes, ages, governments, conditions, or methods of education, the same uniformity and regular operation of natural principles are discernible. Like causes still produce like effects in the same manner as in the mutual action of the elements and powers of nature. There are different trees, which regularly produce fruit, whose relish is different from each other, and this regularity will be admitted as an instance of necessity in causes in external bodies. But are they products of Guyenne and of Champagne more regularly different than they sentiments, actions, and passions of the two sexes, of which the one are distinguished by their force and maturity, the other by their delicacy and softness? Are the changes of our body from infancy to old age more regular and certain than those of our mind and conduct? And would a man be more ridiculous who would expect that an infant of 4 years old will raise a weight of 300 pounds, than one who from a person of the same age would look for a philosophical reasoning, or a prudent and well-concerted action? We must certainly allow that the cohesion of the parts of matter arises from natural and necessary principle. Yes, whatever difficulty we may find in explaining them, and for a reason we must allow that human society is founded on like principles, and our reason in the latter case is better than even that in the former, because we not only observe that men always seek society, but can also explain the principles on which this universal propensity is founded. For is it more certain that two flat pieces of marble will unite together than that two young savages of different sexes will copulate? Do the children arise from this copulation more uniformly than does the parents care for their safety and preservation? And after they have arrived at years of discretion, by the care of their parents, are the inconveniencies attending their separation more certain than their foresight of these inconveniencies, and their care of avoiding them by a close union and confederacy? The skin, pores, muscles, and nerves of a day laborer are different from those of a man of quality. So are his sentiments, actions, and manners. The different stations of life influence the whole fabric. External and internal and different stations arise necessarily, because, uniformly, from the necessary and uniform principles of human nature. Men cannot live without society, and cannot be associated without government. Government makes a distinction of property, and establishes the different ranks of men. This produces industry, traffic, manufactures, lawsuits, war, leagues, alliances, voyages, travels, cities, fleets, ports, and all those other actions and objects which cause such a diversity, and at the same time maintain such an uniformity in human life. Should a traveler, returning from a far country, tell us that he had seen a climate in the 50th degree of northern latitude, where all the fruits ripen and come to perfection in the winter, and decay in the summer, after the same manner as in England they are produced and decay in the contrary seasons, he would find few so credulous as to believe him. I am apt to think a traveler would meet with as little credit who should inform us of people exactly of the same character with those in Plato's Republic on the one hand, or those in Hobbes's Leviathan on the other. There is a general course of nature in human actions, as well as in the operations of the sun and the climate. There are also characters, peculiar to different nations and particular persons, as well as common to mankind. The knowledge of these characters is founded on the observation of an uniformity in the actions that flow from them, and this uniformity forms the very essence of necessity. I can imagine only one way of eluding this argument, which is by denying that uniformity of human actions on which it is founded. As long as actions have a constant union and connection with the situation and temper of the agent, however we may in words refuse to acknowledge the necessity, we really allow the thing. Now some may, perhaps, find a pretext to deny this regular union and connection. For what is more capricious than human actions? What more inconstant than the desires of man? And what creature departs more widely, not only from right reason, but from his own character and disposition? An hour, a moment is sufficient to make him change from one extreme to another, and overturn what cost the greatest pain and labor to establish. Necessity is regular and certain. Human conduct is irregular and uncertain. The one, therefore, proceeds not from the other. To this I reply, that in judging of the actions of men we must proceed upon the same maxims as when we reason concerning external objects. When any phenomena are constantly and invariably conjoined together, they acquire such a connection in the imagination that it passes from one to the other without any doubt or hesitation. But below this there are many inferior degrees of evidence and probability. Nor does one single contrariety of experiment entirely destroy all our reasoning. The mind balances the contrary experiments, and deducting the inferior from the superior, proceeds with that degree of assurance or evidence which remains even when these contrary experiments are entirely equal. We remove not the notion of causes and necessity, but supposing that the usual contrariety proceeds from the operation of contrary and concealed causes, we conclude that the chance or indifference lies only in our judgment on account of our imperfect knowledge, not in the things themselves, which are in every case equally necessary, though to appearance not equally constant or certain. No union can be more constant and certain than that of some actions with some motives and characters, and if in other cases the union is uncertain, it is no more than what happens in the operations of body. Nor can we conclude any thing from the one irregularity, which will not follow equally from the other. It is commonly allowed that madmen have no liberty. But were we to judge by their actions, these have less regularity and constancy than the actions of wise men, and consequently are farther removed from necessity. Our way of thinking in this particular is, therefore, absolutely inconsistent, but is a natural consequence of these confused ideas and undefined terms, which we so commonly make use of in our reasonings, especially on the present subject. We must now show that as the union betwixt moti, ways and actions has the same constancy as that in any natural operations, so its influence on the understanding is also the same, in determining us to infer the existence of one from that of another. If this shall appear, there is no known circumstance that enters into the connection and production of the actions of matter that is not to be found in all the operations of the mind, and consequently we cannot, without a manifest absurdity, attribute necessity to the one and refuse into the other. There is no philosopher whose judgment is so riveted to this fantastical system of liberty, as not to acknowledge the force of moral evidence, and both in speculation and practice proceed upon it, as upon a reasonable foundation. Now moral evidence is nothing but a conclusion concerning the actions of men, derived from the consideration of their motives, temper and situation. Thus when we see certain characters or figures described upon paper, we infer that the person who produced them would affirm such facts: the death of Caesar, the success of Augustus, the cruelty of Nero, in remembering many other concurrent testimonies. We conclude that those facts were once really existent, and that so many men, without any interest, would never conspire to deceive us, especially since they must, in the attempt, expose themselves to the derision of all their contemporaries. When these facts were asserted to be recent and universally known, the same kind of reasoning runs through politics, war, commerce, economy, and indeed mixes itself so entirely in human life that it is impossible to act or subsist a moment without having recourse to it. A prince who imposes a tax upon his subjects expects their compliance. A general who conducts an army makes account of a certain degree of courage. A merchant looks for fidelity and skill in his factor or supercargo. A man who gives orders for his dinner doubts not of the obedience of his servants. In short, as nothing more nearly interests us than our own actions and those of others, the greatest part of our reasonings is employed in judgments concerning them. Now I assert that whoever reasons after this manner does ipso facto believe the actions of the will to arise from necessity, and that he knows not what he means when he denies it. All those objects, of which we call the one cause and the other effect, considered in themselves, are as distinct and separate from each other as any two things in nature, nor can we ever, by the most accurate survey of them, infer the existence of the one from that of the other. It is only from experience and the observation of their constant union that we are able to form this inference, and even after all, the inference is nothing but the effects of custom on the imagination. We must not here be content with saying that the idea of cause and effect arises from objects constantly united, but must affirm that it is the very same with the idea of those objects, and that the necessary connection is not discovered by a conclusion of the understanding, but is merely a perception of the mind. Wherever, therefore, we observe the same union, and wherever the union operates in the same manner upon the belief and opinion, we have the idea of causes and necessity, though perhaps we may avoid those expressions. Motion in one body in all past instances that have fallen under our observation is followed upon impulse by motion in another. It is impossible for the mind to penetrate farther. From this constant union it forms the idea of cause and effect, and by its influence feels the necessity. As there is the same constancy and the same influence in what we call moral evidence, I ask no more. What remains can only be a dispute of words. And indeed, when we consider how aptly natural and moral evidence cement together, and form only one chain of argument betwixt them, we shall make no scruple to allow that they are of the same nature, and derived from the same principles. A prisoner who has neither money nor interest discovers the impossibility of his escape, as well from the obstinacy of the gaoler, as from the walls and bars with which he is surrounded, and in all attempts for his freedom chooses rather to work upon the stone and iron of the one, than upon the inflexible nature of the other. The same prisoner, when conducted to the scaffold, foresees his death is certainly from the constancy and fidelity of his guards, as from the operation of the axe or wheel. His mind runs along a certain train of ideas. The refusal of the soldiers to consent to his escape, the action of the executioner, the separation of the head and body, bleeding, convulsive motions, and death. Here is a connected chain of natural causes and voluntary actions, but the mind feels no difference betwixt them in passing from one link to another, nor is less certain of the future event than if it were connected with the present impressions of the memory and senses by a train of causes cemented together by what we are pleased to call a physical necessity. The same experienced union has the same effect on the mind, whether the united objects be motives, volitions and actions, or figure and motion. We may change the names of things, but their nature and their operation on the understanding never change. I dare be positive no one will ever endeavor to refute these reasonings otherwise than by altering my definitions, and assigning a different meaning to the terms of cause, and effect, and necessity, and liberty, and chance. According to my definitions, necessity makes an essential part of causation and consequently liberty, by removing necessity, removes also causes, and is the very same thing with chance, as chance is commonly thought to imply a contradiction, and is at least directly contrary to experience. There are always the same arguments against liberty or free will. If anyone alters the definitions, I cannot pretend to argue with him until I know the meaning he assigns to these terms. Sect. To the same subject continued. I believe we may assign the three following reasons for the prevalence of the doctrine of liberty, however absurd it may be in one sense, and unintelligible in any other. First, after we have performed any action, though we confess we were influenced by particular views and motives, it is difficult for us to persuade ourselves we were governed by necessity, and that it was utterly impossible for us to have acted otherwise. The idea of necessity seeming to imply something of force, and violence, and constraint, of which we are not sensible. Few are capable of distinguishing betwixt the liberty of spontaneity, as it is called in the schools, and the liberty of indifference, betwixt that which is opposed to violence, and that which means a negation of necessity in causes. The first is even the most common sense of the word, and as it is only that species of liberty which it concerns us to preserve, our thoughts have been principally turned towards it, and have almost universally confounded it with the other. Secondly, there is a false sensation or experience even of the liberty of indifference, which is regarded as an argument for its real existence. The necessity of any action, whether of matter or of the mind, is not properly a quality in the agent, but in any thinking or intelligent being, who may consider the action, and consist in the determination of his thought to infer its existence from some preceding objects, as liberty or chance, on the other hand, is nothing but the want of that determination, and a certain looseness, which we feel in passing or not passing from the idea of one to that of the other. Now we may observe that though in reflecting on human actions we seldom feel such a looseness or indifference, yet it very commonly happens that in performing the actions themselves we are sensible of something like it, and as all related or resembling objects are readily taken for each other, this has been employed as a demonstrative or even an intuitive proof of human liberty. We feel that our actions are subject to our will. On most occasions. And imagine we feel that the will itself is subject to nothing, because when by a denial of it we are provoked to try, we feel that it moves easily every way, and produces an image of itself, even on that side on which it did not settle. This image of faint motion, we persuade ourselves, could have been complete into the thing itself, because, should that be denied, we find, upon a second trial, that it can. But these efforts are all in vain, and whatever capricious and irregular actions we may perform is the desire of showing our liberty is the sole motive of our actions. We can never free ourselves from the bonds of necessity. We may imagine we feel a liberty within ourselves, but a spectator can commonly infer our actions from our motives and character, and even where he cannot, he concludes in general that he might, were he perfectly acquainted with every circumstance of our situation and temper, and the most secret springs of our complexion and disposition. Now this is the very essence of necessity, according to the foregoing doctrine. A third reason why the doctrine of liberty has generally been better received in the world than its antagonist proceeds from religion, which has been very unnecessarily interested in this question. There is no method of reasoning more common, and yet none more blamable, than in philosophical debates to endeavor to refute any hypothesis by a pretext of its dangerous consequences to religion and morality. When any opinion leads us into absurdities, it is certainly false, but it is not certain. An opinion is false because it is of dangerous consequence. Such topics, therefore, ought entirely to be forborne, as serving nothing to the discovery of truth, but only to make the person of an antagonist odious. This I observe in general, without pretending to draw any advantage from it. I submit myself frankly to an examination of this kind, and dare venture to affirm that the doctrine of necessity, according to my explication of it, is not only innocent, but even advantageous to religion and morality. I define necessity two ways, conformable to the two definitions of cause, of which it makes an essential part. I place it either in a constant union and conjunction of like objects, or in the inference of the mind from the one to the other. Now necessity, in both these senses, has universally, though tacitly, in the schools, in the pulpit, and in common life, been allowed to belong to the will of man. And no one has ever pretended to deny that we can draw inferences concerning human actions, and that those inferences are founded on the experienced union of like actions it like motives and circumstances. The only particular in which anyone can differ from me is either that perhaps he will refuse to call this necessity, but as long as the meaning is understood, I hope the word can do no harm, or that he will maintain there is something else in the operations of matter. Now whether it be so or not is of no consequence to religion, whatever it may be to natural philosophy. I may be mistaken in asserting that we have no idea of any other connection in the actions of body, and shall be glad to be farther instructed on that head. But sure I ascribe nothing to the actions of the mind, but what must readily be allowed of. Let no one, therefore, put an invidious construction on my words, by saying simply that I assert the necessity of human actions, and place them on the same footing with the operations of senseless matter. I do not ascribe to the will that unintelligible necessity, which is supposed to lie in matter, but I ascribe to matter that intelligible quality, call it necessity or not, which the most rigorous orthodoxy does or must allow to belong to the will. I change, therefore, nothing in the received systems with regard to the will, but only with regard to material objects. Nay, I shall go farther, and assert that this kind of necessity is so essential to religion and morality, that without it there must ensue an absolute subversion of both, and that every other supposition is entirely destructive to all laws both divine and human. It is indeed certain that as all human laws are founded on rewards and punishments, it is supposed as a fundamental principle that these motives have an influence on the mind, and both produce the good and prevent the evil actions. We may give to this influence what name we please, but as it is usually conjoined with the action, common sense requires it should be esteemed a cause, and be looked upon as an instance of that necessity which I would establish. This reasoning is equally solid when applied to divine laws, so far as the deity is considered as a legislator, and is supposed to inflict punishment and bestow rewards with a design to produce obedience. But I also maintain that even where he acts not in his magisterial capacity, but is regarded as the avenger of crimes merely on account of their odiousness and deformity, not only it is impossible, without the necessary connection of cause and effect in human actions, that punishments could be inflicted compatible with justice and moral equity, but also that it could ever enter into the thoughts of any reasonable being to inflict them. The constant and universal object of hatred or anger is a person or creature endowed with thought and consciousness, and when any criminal or injurious actions excite that passion, it is only by their relation to the person or connection with him. But, according to the doctrine of liberty or chance, this connection is reduced to nothing, nor are men more accountable for those actions which are designed and premeditated, than for such as are the most casual and accidental. Actions are by their very nature temporary and perishing, in where they proceed not from some cause in the characters and disposition of the person who performed them. They infix not themselves upon him, and can neither redound to his honor, if good, nor infamy, if evil. The action itself may be blamable, it may be contrary to all the rules of morality and religion, but the person is not responsible for it, and as it proceeded from nothing in him that is durable or constant, and leaves nothing of that nature behind it, it is impossible he can, upon its account, become the object of punishment or vengeance, according to the hypothesis of liberty. Therefore, a man is as pure and untainted, after having committed the most horrid crimes, as at the first moment of his birth, nor is his character any way concerned in his actions, since they are not derived from it, and the wickedness of the one can never be used as a proof of the depravity of the other. It is only upon the principles of necessity that a person acquires any merit or demerit from his actions. However, the common opinion may incline to the contrary, but so inconsistent are men with themselves, that though they often assert that necessity utterly destroys all merit and demerit either towards mankind or superior powers, yet they continue still to reason upon these very principles of necessity in all their judgments. Concerning this matter, men are not blamed for such evil actions as they perform ignorantly and casually, whatever may be their consequences. Why? But because the causes of these actions are only momentary, and terminate in them alone, men are less blamed for such evil actions, as they perform hastily and impremeditately. then for such as proceed from thought and deliberation. For what reason? But because a hasty temper, though a constant cause in the mind, operates only by intervals, and infects not the whole character. Again, repentance wipes off every crime, especially if attended with an evident reformation of life and manners. How is this to be accounted for? But by asserting that actions render a person criminal, merely as they are proofs of criminal passions or principles in the mind, and when by any alteration of these principles they cease to be just proofs, they likewise cease to be criminal. But according to the doctrine of liberty or chance they never were just proofs, and consequently never were criminal. Here then I turn to my adversary, and desire him to free his own system from these odious consequences before he charge them upon others. Or if he rather chooses that this question should be decided by fair arguments before philosophers, then by declamations before the people, let him return to what I have advanced to prove that liberty and chance are synonymous, and concerning the nature of moral evidence and the regularity of human actions. Upon a review of these reasonings, I cannot doubt of an entire victory in therefore having proved that all actions of the will have particular causes. I proceed to explain what these causes are, and how they operate. Sect 3 The influencing motives of the will. Nothing is more usual in philosophy, and even in common life, than to talk of the combat of passion and reason, to give the preference to reason, and assert that men are only so far virtuous as they conform themselves to its dictates. Every rational creature, it is said, is obliged to regulate his actions by reason, and if any other motive or principle challenge the direction of his conduct, he ought to oppose it, till it be entirely subdued, or at least brought to a conformity with that superior principle. On this method of thinking the greatest part of moral philosophy, antient and modern, seems to be founded, nor is there an ampler field, as well for metaphysical arguments as popular declamations, than this supposed preeminence of reason above passion. The eternity, invariableness, and divine origin of the former have been displayed to the best advantage. The blindness, inconstancy, and deceitfulness of the latter have been as strongly insisted on. In order to show the fallacy of all this philosophy, I shall endeavor to prove, first, that reason alone can never be a motive to any action of the will, and secondly, that it can never oppose passion in the direction of the will. The understanding exerts itself after two different ways, as it judges from demonstration or probability, as it regards the abstract relations of our ideas, or those relations of objects, of which experience only gives us information. I believe it scarce will be asserted that the first species of reasoning alone is ever the cause of any action, as its proper province is the world of ideas, and as the will always places us in that of realities. Demonstration and volition seem, upon that account, to be totally removed from each other. Mathematics, indeed, are useful in all mechanical operations, and arithmetic in almost every art and profession, but it is not of themselves they have any influence. Mechanics are the art of regulating the motions of bodies to some designed end or purpose, and the reason why we employ arithmetic in fixing the proportions of numbers is only that we may discover the proportions of their influence and operation. A merchant is desirous of knowing the sum total of his accounts with any person. Why? But that he may learn what sum will have the same effects in paying his debt. And, going to market, as all the particular articles taken together. Abstract or demonstrative reasoning, therefore, never influences any of our actions, but only as it directs our judgment concerning causes and effects, which leads us to the second operation of the understanding. It is obvious that when we have the prospect of pain or pleasure from any object, we feel a consequent emotion of aversion or propensity, and are carried to avoid or embrace what will give us this uneasiness or satisfaction. It is also obvious that this emotion rests not here, but, making us cast our view on every side, comprehends whatever objects are connected with its original one by the relation of cause and effect. Here then reasoning takes place to discover this relation, and according as our reasoning varies, our actions receive a subsequent variation. But it is evident in this case that the impulse arises not from reason, but is only directed by it. It is from the prospect of pain or pleasure that the aversion or propensity arises towards any object, and these emotions extend themselves to the causes and effects of that object, as they are pointed out to us by reason and experience. It can never in the least concern us to know that such objects are causes, and such others effects, if both the causes and effects be indifferent to us, where they objects themselves do not affect us. Their connection can never give them any influence, and it is plain that as reason is nothing but a discovery of this connection, it cannot be by its means that the objects are able to affect us. Since reason alone can never produce any action, or give rise to volition, I infer that the same faculty is as incapable of preventing volition, or of disputing the preference with any passion or emotion. This consequence is necessary. It is impossible reason could have a latter effect of preventing volition, but by giving an impulse in a contrary direction to our passion, and that impulse, had it operated alone, would have been able to produce volition. Nothing can oppose or retard the impulse of passion, but a contrary impulse, and if this contrary impulse ever arises from reason, that latter faculty must have an original influence on the will, and saint be able to cause, as well as hinder any act of volition. But if reason has no original influence, it is impossible it can withstand any principle which has such an efficacy, or ever keep the mind in suspense a moment. Thus it appears that the principle which opposes our passion cannot be the same with reason, and is only called so in an improper sense. We speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of the combat of passion and of reason. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. As this opinion may appear somewhat extraordinary, it may not be improper to confirm it by some other considerations. A passion is an original existence, or, if you will, modification of existence, and contains not any representative quality, which renders it a copy of any other existence or modification. When I am angry, I am actually possessed with the passion, and in that emotion have no more a reference to any other object than when I am thirsty, or sick, or more than 5 foot high. It is impossible, therefore, that this passion can be opposed by, or be contradictory to truth and reason, since this contradiction consists in the disagreement of ideas, considered as copies, with those objects which they represent. What may at first occur on this head is that as nothing can be contrary to truth or reason, except what has a reference to it, and as the judgments of our understanding only have this reference, It must follow that passions can be contrary to reason only so far as they are accompanied with some judgment or opinion. According to this principle, which is so obvious and natural, it is only in two senses that any affection can be called unreasonable. First, when a passion, such as hope or fear, grief or joy, despair or security, is founded on the supposition or the existence of objects, which really do not exist. Secondly, when in exerting any passion in action, we choose a means insufficient for the designed end, and deceive ourselves in our judgment of causes and effects, where a passion is neither founded on false suppositions, nor chooses means insufficient for the end. The understanding can neither justify nor condemn it. It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. It is not contrary to reason for me to choose my total ruin. To prevent the least uneasiness of an Indian or person wholly unknown to me, it is as little contrary to reason to prefer even my own acknowledge add lesser good to my greater, and have a more ardent affection for the former than the latter. A trivial good may, from certain circumstances, produce a desire superior to what arises from the greatest and most valuable enjoyment, nor is there anything more extraordinary in this than in mechanics to see 1 pound weight raise up 100 by the advantage of its situation. In short, a passion must be accompanied with some false judgment in order to its being unreasonable, and even then it is not the passion, properly speaking, which is unreasonable, but the judgment. The consequences are evident, since a passion can never, in any sense, be called unreasonable, but when founded on a false supposition or when it chooses means insufficient for the designed end. It is impossible that reason and passion can ever oppose each other, or dispute for the government of the will and actions. The moment we perceive the falsehood of any supposition, or the insufficiency of any means, our passions yield to our reason without any opposition. I may desire any fruit as of an excellent relish, but whenever you convince me of my mistake, my longing ceases. I may will the performance of certain actions as means of obtaining any desired good, but as my willing of these actions is only secondary, and founded on the supposition that they are causes of the proposed effect, as soon as I discover the falsehood of that supposition, they must become indifferent to me. It is natural for one that does not examine objects with a strict philosophic eye to imagine that those actions of the mind are entirely the same, which produce not a different sensation, and are not immediately distinguishable to the feeling in perception. Reason, for instance, exerts itself without producing any sensible emotion, and, except in the more sublime disquisitions of philosophy, or in the frivolous subtleties of the school, scarce ever conveys any pleasure or uneasiness. Hence it proceeds that every action of the mind, which operates with the same calmness and tranquility, is confounded with reason by all those who judge of things from the first view in appearance. Now it is certain, there are certain calm desires and tendencies, which, though they be real passions, produce little emotion in the mind, and are more known by their effects than by the immediate feeling or sensation. These desires are of two kinds: either certain instincts originally implanted in our natures, such as benevolence and resentment, the love of life, and kindness to children, or the general appetite to good, and aversion to evil, considered merely as such. When any of these passions are calm, and cause no disorder in the soul, they are very readily taken for the determinations of reason, and are supposed to proceed from the same faculty with that which judges of truth and falsehood. Their nature and principles have been supposed the same, because their sensations are not evidently different. Beside these calm passions, which often determine the will, there are certain violent emotions of the same kind, which have likewise a great influence on that faculty. When I receive any injury from another, I often feel a violent passion of resentment, which makes me desire his evil and punishment, independent of all considerations of pleasure and advantage to myself. When I am immediately threatened with any grievous ill, my fears, apprehensions, and aversions rise to a great height, and produce a sensible emotion. The common error of metaphysicians has lain in ascribing the direction of the will entirely to one of these principles, and supposing the other to have no influence. Men often act knowingly against their interest, for which reason the view of the greatest possible good does not always influence them. Men often counteract a violent passion in prosecution of their interests and designs. It is not therefore the present uneasiness alone which determines them. In general, we may observe that both these principles operate on the will, and where they are contrary, that either of them prevails, according to the general character or present disposition of the person. What we call strength of mind implies the prevalence of the calm passions above the violent, though we may easily observe there is no man so constantly possessed of this virtue as never on any occasion to yield to the solicitations of passion and desire. From these variations of temper proceeds the great difficulty of deciding concerning the actions and resolutions of men, where there is any contrariety of motives and passions. Sect IV of the causes of the violent passions. There is not in philosophy a subject of more nice speculation than this, of the different causes and effects of the calm and violent passions. It is evident passions influence not the will in proportion to their violence, or the disorder they occasion in the temper, but on the contrary, that when a passion has once become a settled principle of action, and is the predominant inclination of the soul, it commonly produces no longer any sensible agitation, as repeated custom and its own force have made everything yield to it. It directs the actions and conduct without that opposition and emotion, which so naturally attend every momentary gust of passion. We must, therefore, distinguish betwixt a calm and a weak passion, betwixt a violent and a strong one. But, notwithstanding this, it is certain that when we would govern a man and push him to any action, it will commonly be better policy to work upon the violent than the calm passions, and rather take him by his inclination than what is vulgarly called his reason. We ought to place the object in such particular situations as are proper to increase the violence of the passion, for we may observe that all depends upon the situation of the object, and that a variation in this particular will be able to change the calm and the violent passions into each other. Both these kinds of passions pursue good and avoid evil, and both of them are increased or diminished by the increase or diminution of the good or evil. But herein lies the difference betwixt them. The same good, when near, will cause a violent passion, which, when remote, produces only a calm one. As this subject belongs very properly to the present question concerning the will, we shall here examine it to the bottom, and shall consider some of those circumstances and situations of objects which render a passion either calm or violent. It is a remarkable property of human nature that any emotion, which attends a passion, is easily converted into it, though in their natures, they be originally different from, and even contrary to each other. It is true in order to make a perfect union among passions. There is always required a double relation of impressions and ideas, nor is one relation sufficient for that purpose. But though this be confirmed by undoubted experience, we must understand it with its proper limitations, and must regard the double relation as requisite only to make one passion produce another. When two passions are already produced by their separate causes, and are both present in the mind, they readily mingle and unite, though they have but one relation, and sometimes without any. The predominant passion swallows up the inferior, and converts it into itself. The spirits, when once excited, easily receive a change in their direction, and it is natural to imagine this change will come from a prevailing affection. The connection is in many respects closer betwixt any two passions than betwixt any passion and indifference. When a person is once heartily in love, the little faults and caprices of his mistress, the jealousies and quarrels, to which that commerce is so subject, however unpleasant and related to anger and hatred, are yet found to give additional force to the prevailing passion. It is a common artifice of politicians, when they would affect any person very much by a matter of fact, of which they intend to inform him, first to excite his curiosity, delay as long as possible the satisfying it, and by that means raise his anxiety and impatience to the utmost. Before they give him a full insight into the business, they know that his curiosity will precipitate him into the passion they design to raise, and assist the object in its influence on the mind. A soldier advancing to the battle is naturally inspired with courage and confidence when he thinks on his friends and fellow soldiers, and is struck with fear and terror when he reflects on the enemy. Whatever new emotion, therefore, proceeds from the former naturally increases the courage, as the same emotion proceeding from the latter augments the fear by the relation of ideas, and the conversion of the inferior emotion into the predominant. Hence, it is that in martial discipline, the uniformity and luster of our habit, the regularity of our figures and motions, with all the pomp and majesty of war, encourage ourselves and allies, while the same objects in the enemy strike terror into us, though agreeable and beautiful in themselves. Since passions, however independent, are naturally transfused into each other, if they are both present at the same time, it follows that when good or evil is placed in such a situation as to cause any particular emotion, beside its direct passion of desire or aversion, that latter passion must acquire new force and violence. This happens, among other cases, whenever any object excites contrary passions, for it is observable that an opposition of passions commonly causes a new emotion in the spirits, and produces more disorder than the concurrence of any two affections of equal force. This new emotion is easily converted into the predominant passion, and increases its violence beyond the pitch it would have arrived at had it met with no opposition. Hence we naturally desire what is forbid, and take a pleasure in performing actions, merely because they are unlawful. The notion of duty, when opposite to the passions, is seldom able to overcome them, and when it fails of that effect, is apt rather to increase them, by producing an opposition in our motives and principles. The same effect follows whether the opposition arises from internal motives or external obstacles. The passion commonly acquires new force and violence in both cases. The efforts which the mind makes to surmount the obstacle excite the spirits and enliven the passion. Uncertainty has the same influence as opposition. The agitation of the thought, the quick turns it makes from one view to another, the variety of passions which succeed each other according to the different views. All these produce an agitation in the mind and transfuse themselves into the predominant passion. There is not, in my opinion, any other natural cause why security diminishes the passions than because it removes that uncertainty which increases them. The mind, when left to itself, immediately languishes, and in order to preserve its ardor, must be every moment supported by a new flow of passion. For the same reason, despair, though contrary to security, has a like influence. It is certain nothing more powerfully animates any affection than to conceal some part of its object by throwing it into a kind of shade, which at the same time that it choose enough to prepossess us in favor of the object, leaves still some work for the imagination. Besides that, obscurity is always attended with a kind of uncertainty. The effort which the fancy makes to complete the idea ruses the spirits, and gives an additional force to the passion. As despair and security, though contrary to each other, produce the same effects, so absence is observed to have contrary effects, and in different circumstances either increases or diminishes our affections. The Duc de la Rochefoucauld has very well observed that absence destroys weak passions, but increases strong as the wind extinguishes a candle, but blows up a fire. Long absence naturally weakens our idea and diminishes the passion, but where the idea is so strong and lively as to support itself, the uneasiness arising from absence increases the passion and gives it new force and violence. Sect V of the effects of custom. But nothing has a greater effect both to increase and diminish our passions, to convert pleasure into pain, and pain into pleasure, than custom and repetition. Custom has two original effects upon the mind. In bestowing a facility in the performance of any action or the conception of any object, and afterwards a tendency or inclination towards it. And from these we may account for all its other effects, however extraordinary, when the soul applies itself to the performance of any action, or the conception of any object, to which it is not accustomed. There is a certain impliableness in the faculties, and a difficulty of the spirits, moving in their new direction. As this difficulty excites the spirits, it is the source of wonder, surprise, and of all the emotions which arise from novelty, and is in itself very agreeable. Like everything which enlivens the mind to a moderate degree, but though surprise be agreeable in itself, yet as it puts the spirits in agitation, it not only augments our agreeable affections, but also are painful, according to the foregoing principle, that every emotion which precedes or attends a passion is easily converted into it. Hence everything that is new is most affecting, and gives us either more pleasure or pain than what, strictly speaking, naturally belongs to it. When it often returns upon us, the novelty wears off, the passions subside, the hurry of the spirits is over, and we survey the objects with greater tranquility. By degrees the repetition produces a facility of the human mind, and an infallible source of pleasure, where the facility goes not beyond a certain degree. And here it is remarkable that the pleasure which arises from a moderate facility has not the same tendency with that which arises from novelty. to augment the painful, as well as the agreeable affections. The pleasure of facility does not so much consist in any ferment of the spirits, as in their orderly motion, which will sometimes be so powerful as even to convert pain into pleasure, and give us a relish in time what at first was most harsh and disagreeable. But again, as facility converts pain into pleasure, so it often converts pleasure into pain, when it is too great, and renders the actions of the mind so faint and languid, that they are no longer able to interest and support it, and indeed, scarce any other objects become disagreeable through custom but such as are naturally attended with some emotion or affection, which is destroyed by the too frequent repetition. One can consider the clouds, and heavens, and trees, and stones, however frequently repeated, without ever feeling any aversion. But when they fair sex, or music, or good cheer, or anything that naturally ought to be agreeable, becomes indifferent, it easily produces the opposite affection. But custom not only gives a facility to perform any action, but likewise an inclination and tendency towards it, where it is not entirely disagreeable, and can never be the object of inclination. And this is the reason why custom increases all active habits, but diminishes passive. According to the observation of a late eminent philosopher, the facility takes off from the force of the passive habits by rendering the motion of the spirits faint and languid. But as in the active, the spirits are sufficiently supported of themselves, the tendency of the mind gives them new force, and bends them more strongly to the action. Sect. We of the influence of the imagination on the passions. It is remarkable that the imagination and affections have close union together, and that nothing which affects the former can be entirely indifferent to the latter. Wherever our ideas of good or evil acquire new vivacity, the passions become more violent and keep pace with the imagination in all its variations. Whether this proceeds from the principle above mentioned, that any attendant emotion is easily converted into the predominant, I shall not determine. It is sufficient, for my present purpose, that we have many instances to confirm this influence of the imagination upon the passions. Any pleasure with which we are acquainted affects us more than any other which we own to be superior, but of whose nature we are wholly ignorant. Of the one we can form a particular and determinate idea. The other we conceive under the general notion of pleasure, and it is certain that the more general and universal any of our ideas are, the less influence they have upon the imagination. A general idea, though it be nothing but a particular one considered in a certain view, is commonly more obscure in that because no particular idea, by which we represent a general one, is ever fixed or determinate, but may easily be changed for other particular ones, which will serve equally in the representation. There is a noted passage in the history of Greece, which may serve for our present purpose. Themistocles told the Athenians that he had formed a design which would be highly useful to the public, but which it was impossible for him to communicate to them without ruining the execution, since its success depended entirely on the secrecy with which it should be conducted. The Athenians, instead of granting him full power to act as he thought fitting, ordered him to communicate his design to Aristides, in whose prudence they had an entire confidence, and whose opinion they were resolved blindly to submit to. The design of Themistocles was secretly to set fire to the fleet of all the Grecian commonwealths, which was assembled in a neighboring port, and which, being once destroyed, would give the Athenians the empire of the sea. Without any rival, Aristides returned to the assembly, and told them that nothing could be more advantageous than the design of Themistocles, but at the same time that nothing could be more unjust. Upon which the people unanimously rejected the project. A late celebrated historian admires this passage of ancient history as one of the most singular that is anywhere to be met. 1 Mons. Rollin, Charles Rollin, Histoire ancienne, Paris 1730–38. Closing curly bracket dot. Here, says he, they are not philosophers, to whom it is easy in their schools to establish the finest maxims and most sublime rules of morality, who decide that interest ought never to prevail above justice. It is a whole people interested in the proposal which is made to them, who consider it as of importance to the public good, and who, notwithstanding, reject it unanimously, and without hesitation, merely because it is contrary to justice. For my part, one see nothing so extraordinary in this proceeding of the Athenians. The same reasons which render it so easy for philosophers to establish these sublime maxims tend, in part, to diminish the merit of such a conduct in that people. Philosophers never balance betwixt profit and honesty, because their decisions are general, and neither their passions nor imaginations are interested in the objects. And, though in the present case the advantage was immediate to the Athenians, yet as it was known only under the general notion of advantage, without being conceived by any particular idea, it must have had a less considerable influence on their imaginations, and have been a less violent temptation, than if they had been acquainted with all its circumstances. Otherwise it is difficult to conceive that a whole people, unjust and violent as men commonly are, should so unanimously have adhered to justice, and rejected any considerable advantage, any satisfaction, which we lately enjoyed, and of which the memory is fresh and recent, operates on the will with more violence than another, of which the traces are decayed, and almost obliterated. From whence does this proceed, but that the memory in the first case assists the fancy and gives an additional force and vigor to its conceptions? The image of the past pleasure, being strong and violent, bestows these qualities on the idea of the future pleasure, which is connected with it by the relation of resemblance. A pleasure which is suitable to the way of life in which we are engaged excites more our desires and appetites than another, which is foreign to it. This phenomenon may be explained from the same principle. Nothing is more capable of infusing any passion into the mind than eloquence, by which objects are represented in their strongest and most lively colors. We may of ourselves acknowledge that such an object is valuable, and such another odious, but until an orator excites the imagination, and gives force to these ideas, they may have but a feeble influence either on the will or the affections. But eloquence is not always necessary. The bare opinion of another, especially when enforced with passion, will cause an idea of good or evil to have an influence upon us, which would otherwise have been entirely neglected. This proceeds from the principle of sympathy or communication, and sympathy, as I have already observed, is nothing but the conversion of an idea into an impression by the force of imagination. It is remarkable that lively passions commonly attend a lively imagination. In this respect, as well as others, the force of the passion depends as much on the temper of the person as the nature or Situation of the object. I have already observed that belief is nothing but a lively idea, related to a present impression. This vivacity is a requisite circumstance to the exciting all our passions, the calm as well as the violent, nor has a mere fiction of the imagination any considerable influence upon either of them. It is too weak to take hold of the mind, or be attended with emotion. Sect. 7 of contiguity and distance in space and time. There is an easy reason why everything contiguous to us, either in space or time, should be conceived with a peculiar force and vivacity, and excel every other object in its influence on the imagination. Our self is intimately present to us, and whatever is related to self must partake of that quality. But where an object is so far removed as to have lost the advantage of this relation, why, as it is farther removed, its idea becomes still fainter and more obscure, would, perhaps, require a more particular examination. It is obvious that the imagination can never totally forget the points of space and time in which we are existent, but receives such frequent advertisements of them from the passions and senses, that however it may turn its attention to foreign and remote objects, it is necessitated every moment to reflect on the present. It is also remarkable that in the conception of those objects which we regard as real and existent, we take them in their proper order and situation, and never leap from one object to another which is distant from it, without running over, at least in a cursory manner, all those objects which are interposed betwixt them. When we reflect, therefore, on any object distant from ourselves, we are obliged not only to reach it at first by passing through all the intermediate space betwixt ourselves and the object, but also to renew our progress every moment, being every moment recalled to the consideration of ourselves and our present situation. It is easily conceived that this interruption must weaken the idea by breaking the action of the mind, and hindering the conception from being so intense and continued as when we reflect on a nearer object. The fewer steps we make to arrive at the object, and the smoother the road is, this diminution of vivacity is less sensibly felt, but still may be observed, more or less in proportion to the degrees of distance and difficulty. Here then we are to consider two kinds of objects, the contiguous and remote, of which the former, by means of their relation to ourselves, approach an impression in force and vivacity, the latter by reason of the interruption in our manner of conceiving them, appear in a weaker and more imperfect light. This is their effect on the imagination. If my reasoning be just, they must have a proportionable effect on the will and passions. Contiguous objects must have an influence much superior to the distant and remote. Accordingly, we find in common life that men are principally concerned about those objects which are not much removed, either in space or time, enjoying the present, and leaving what is afar off to the care of chance and fortune. Talk to a man of his condition 30 years hence, and he will not regard you. Speak of what is to happen tomorrow, and he will lend you attention. The breaking of a mirror gives us more concern when at home than the burning of a house when abroad, and some 100 leagues distant. But farther, though distance both in space and time has a considerable effect on the imagination, and by that means on the will and passions, yet the consequences of a removal in space are much inferior to those of a removal in time. 20 years are certainly but a small distance of time in comparison of what history and even the memory of some may inform them of, and yet I doubt if 1,000 leagues, or even the greatest distance of place this globe can admit of, will so remarkably weaken our ideas and diminish our passions. A West Indian merchant will tell you that he is not without concern about what passes in Jamaica, though few extend their views so far into futurity as to dread very remote accidents. The cause of this phenomenon must evidently lie in the different properties of space and time. Without having recourse to metaphysics, anyone may easily observe that space or extension consists of a number of coexistent parts disposed in a certain order, and capable of being at once present to the sight or feeling. On the contrary, time or succession, though it consists likewise of parts, never presents to us more than one at once, nor is it possible for any two of them ever to be coexistent. These qualities of the objects have a suitable effect on the imagination, the parts of extension being susceptible of an union to the senses, acquire an union in the fancy, and as the appearance of one part excludes not another, the transition or passage of the thought through the contiguous parts is by that means rendered more smooth and easy. On the other hand, the incompatibility of the parts of time in their real existence separates them in the imagination, and makes it more difficult for that faculty to trace any long succession or series of events. Every part must appear single and alone, nor can regularly have entrance into the fancy without banishing what is supposed to have been immediately precedent. By this means any distance in time causes a greater interruption in the thought than an equal distance in space, and consequently weakens more considerably the idea, and consequently the passions which depend in a great measure on the imagination. According to my system, there is another phenomenon of a like nature with the foregoing, viz., the superior effects of the same distance in futurity above that in the past. This difference with respect to the will is easily accounted for, as none of our actions can alter the past. It is not strange it should never determine the will, but with respect to the passions the question is yet entire, and well worth the examining. Besides the propensity to a gradual progression through the points of space and time, we have another peculiarity in our method of thinking, which concurs in producing this phenomenon. We always follow the succession of time in placing our ideas, and from the consideration of any object pass more easily to that which follows immediately after it than to that which went before it. We may learn this, among other instances, from the order which is always observed in historical narrations. Nothing but an absolute necessity can oblige an historian to break the order of time, and in his narration give the precedence to an event which was in reality posterior to another. This will easily be applied to the question in hand. If we reflect on what I have before observed, that the present situation of the person is always that of the imagination, and that it is from thence we proceed to the conception of any distant object. When the object is past, the progression of the thought in passing to it from the present is contrary to nature, as proceeding from one point of time to that which is preceding, and from that to another proceeding, in opposition to the natural course of the succession. On the other hand, when we turn our thought to a future object, our fancy flows along the stream of time, and arrives at the object by an order which seems most natural, passing always from one point of time to that which is immediately posterior to it. This easy progression of ideas favors the imagination, and makes it conceive its object in a stronger and fuller light than when we are continually opposed in our passage, and are obliged to overcome the difficulties arising from the natural propensity of the fancy. A small degree of distance in the past has, therefore, a greater effect in interrupting and weakening the conception than a much greater in the future. From this effect of it on the imagination is derived its influence on the will and passions. There is another cause, which both contributes to the same effect, and proceeds from the same quality of the fancy, by which we are determined to trace the succession of time by a similar succession of ideas. When, from the empty instant we consider 2 points of time equally distant, in the future and in the past, it is evident that, abstractedly considered, their relation to the present is almost equal. For as the future will sometime be present, so the past was once present. If we could, therefore, remove this quality of the imagination, an equal distance in the past and in the future would have a similar influence. Nor is this only true when the fancy remains fixed, and from the present instant surveys the future and the past, but also when it changes its situation, and places us in different periods of time. For, as on the one hand, in supposing ourselves existent in a point of time, interposed betwixt the present instant and the future object, we find the future object approach to us, and the past retire, and become more distant. So on the other hand, in supposing ourselves existent in a point of time interposed betwixt the present and the past approaches to us, and the future becomes more distant. But from the property of the fancy above mentioned we rather choose to fix our thought on the point of time interposed betwixt the present and the future, than on that betwixt the present and the past we advance, rather than retard, our existence in following what seems the natural succession of time. Proceed from past to present, and from present to future, by which means we conceive the future as flowing every moment nearer us, and the past as retiring an equal distance. Therefore, in the past and in the future, has not the same effect on the imagination, and that because we consider the one as continually increasing, and the other as continually diminishing. The fancy anticipates the course of things, and surveys the object in that condition to which it tends, as well as in that which is regarded as the present. Sect 8. The same subject continued. Thus we have accounted for 3 phenomena, which seem pretty remarkable. Why distance weakens the conception and passion. Why distance in time has a greater effect than that in space. And why distance in past time has still a greater effect than that in future. We must now consider 3 phenomena, which seem to be, in a manner, the reverse of these. Why a very great distance increases our esteem and admiration for an object, why such a distance in time increases it more than that in space, and a distance in past time more than that in future. The curiousness of the subject will, I hope, excuse my dwelling on it for some time. To begin with the first phenomenon, why a great distance increases our esteem and admiration for an object, it is evident that the mere view and contemplation of any greatness, whether successive or extended, enlarges the soul, and give it a sensible delight and pleasure. A wide plain, the ocean, eternity, a succession of several ages, all these are entertaining objects, and excel everything, however beautiful, which accompanies not its beauty with a suitable greatness. Now when any very distant object is presented to the imagination, we naturally reflect on the interposed distance, and by that means, conceiving something great and magnificent, receive the usual satisfaction. But as the fancy passes easily from one idea to another related to it, and transports to the second all the passions excited by the first, the admiration, which is directed to the distance, naturally diffuses itself over the distant object. Accordingly, we find that it is not necessary the object should be actually distant from us in order to cause our admiration, but that it is sufficient if, by the natural association of ideas, it conveys our view to any considerable distance. A great traveler, though in the same chamber, will pass for a very extraordinary person as a Greek medal, even in our cabinet, is always esteemed a valuable curiosity. Here the object, by a natural transition, conveys our views to the distance, and the admiration, which arises from that distance, by another natural transition, returns back to the object. But though every great distance produces an admiration for the distant object, a distance in time has a more considerable effect than that in space. Antient busts and inscriptions are more valued than Japan tables. And not to mention the Greeks and Romans, it is certain we regard with more veneration the old Chaldeans and Egyptians than the modern Chinese and Persians, and bestow more fruitless pains to dear up the history and chronology of the former than it would cost us to make a voyage, and be certainly informed of the character, learning and government of the latter. I shall be obliged to make a digression in order to explain this phenomenon. It is a quality very observable in human nature, that any opposition, which does not entirely discourage and intimidate us, has rather a contrary effect, and inspires us with a more than ordinary grandeur and magnanimity. In collecting our force to overcome the opposition, we invigorate the soul, and give it an elevation with which otherwise it would never have been acquainted. Compliance, by rendering our strength useless, makes us insensible of it, but opposition awakens and employs it. This is also true in the universe. Opposition not only enlarges the soul, but the soul, when full of courage and magnanimity, in a manner, seeks opposition. Spumentum dari pecora inter inertia vo. Tis optet uprum, out fulvum descender monte leonum. And, among the tamer beasts, he longs to be granted, in answer to his prayers, a slavering boar, or to have a tawny lion come down from the mountain. Whatever supports and fills the passions is agreeable to us, as on the contrary, what weakens and enfeebles them is uneasy. As opposition has the first effect, and facility the second, no wonder the mind, in certain dispositions, desires the former, and is averse to the latter. These principles have an effect on the imagination as well as on the passions. To be convinced of this, we need only consider the influence of heights and depths on that faculty. Any great elevation of place communicates a kind of pride or sublimity of imagination, and gives a fancied superiority over those that lie below, and vice versa. A sublime and strong imagination conveys the idea of ascent and elevation. Hence it proceeds that we associate, in a manner, the idea of whatever is good with that of height, and evil with lowness. Heaven is supposed to be above, and hell below. A noble genius is called an elevate and sublime one. AtqueueidemspernithummufugIente penna spurns the dank soil in winged flight. On the contrary, a vulgar and trivial conception is stilled indifferently low or mean. Prosperity is denominated ascent, and adversity descent. Kings and princes are supposed to be placed at the top of human affairs as peasants and day laborers are said to be in the lowest stations. These methods of thinking and of expressing ourselves are not of so little consequence as they may appear at first sight. It is evident to common sense, as well as philosophy, that there is no natural nor essential difference betwixt high and low, and that this distinction arises only from the gravitation of matter, which produces a motion from the one to the other, the very same direction, which in this part of the globe is called ascent, is denominated descent in our antipodes, which can proceed from nothing but the contrary tendency of bodies. Now it is certain that the tendency of bodies, continually operating upon our senses, must produce, from custom, a like tendency in the fancy, and that when we consider any object situated in an ascent, the idea of its weight gives us a propensity to transport it from a place in which it is situated to the place immediately below it, and so on, until we come to the ground, which equally stops the body and our imagination. For a like reason we feel a difficulty in mounting, and pass not without a kind of reluctance from the inferior to that which is situated above it, as if our ideas acquired a kind of gravity from their objects. As a proof of this, do we not find that the facility, which is so much studied in music and poetry, is called the fail or cadency of the harmony or period, the idea of facility communicating to us that of descent, in the same manner as descent produces a facility? Since the imagination, therefore, in running from low to high, finds an opposition in its internal qualities and principles, and since the soul, when elevated with joy and courage, in a manner seeks opposition, and throws itself with alacrity into any scene of thought or action, where its courage meets with matter to nourish and employ it, it follows that everything which invigorates and enlivens the soul, whether by touching the passions or imagination, naturally conveys to the fancy this inclination for ascent, and determines it to run against the natural stream of its thoughts and conceptions. This aspiring progress of the imagination suits the present disposition of the mind, and a difficulty, instead of extinguishing its vigor and alacrity, has a contrary effect of sustaining and increasing it. Virtue, genius, power, and riches are for this reason associated with height and sublimity, as poverty, slavery, and folly are conjoined with descent and lowness. Were the case the same with us as Milton represents it to be with the angels, to whom descent is adverse, and who cannot sink without labor and compulsion, this order of things would be entirely inverted, as appears hence, that the very nature of ascent and descent is derived from a difficulty and propensity, and consequently every one of their effects proceeds from that origin. All this is easily applied to the present question: why a considerable distance in time produces a greater veneration for the distant objects than a like removal in space. The imagination moves with more difficulty in passing from one portion of time to another than in a transition through the paths of space, and that because space or extension appears united to our senses, while time or succession is always broken and divided. This difficulty, when joined with a small distance, interrupts and weakens the fancy, but has a contrary effect in a great removal. The mind, elevated by the vastness of its object, is still farther elevated by the difficulty of the conception, and being obliged every moment to renew its efforts in the transition from one part of time to another, feels a more vigorous and sublime disposition than in a transition through the paths of space, where the ideas flow along with easiness and facility. In this disposition, the imagination, passing, as is usual, from the consideration of the distance to the view of the distant objects, gives us a proportionable veneration for it, and this is the reason why all the relicts of antiquity are so precious in our eyes, and appear more valuable than what is brought even from the remotest parts of the world. The third phenomenon I have remarked will be a full confirmation of this. It is not every removal in time which has the effect of producing veneration and esteem. We are not apt to imagine our posterity will excel us or equal our ancestors. This phenomenon is the more remarkable because any distance in futurity weakens not our ideas so much as an equal removal in the past, though a removal in the past, when very great, increases our passions beyond a like removal in the future. Yet a small removal has a greater influence in diminishing them. In our common way of thinking we are placed in a kind of middle station betwixt the past and future, and as our imagination finds a kind of difficulty in running along the former, and a facility in following the course of the latter, the difficulty conveys the notion of ascent, and the facility of the contrary. Hence we imagine our ancestors to be, in a manner, mounted above us, and our posterity to lie below us. Our fancy arrives not at the one without effort, but easily reaches the other, which effort weakens the conception, where the distance is small but enlarges and elevates the imagination, when attended with a suitable object. As on the other hand, the facility assists the fancy in a small removal, but takes off from its force when it contemplates any considerable distance. It may not be improper, before we leave this subject of the will, to resume, in a few words, all that has been said concerning it, in order to set the whole more distinctly before the eyes of the reader. What we commonly understand by passion is a violent and sensible emotion of mind, when any good or evil is presented, or any object, which, by the original formation of our faculties, is fitted to excite an appetite. By reason we mean affections of the very same kind with the former, but such as operate more calmly, and cause no disorder in the temper, which tranquility leads us into a mistake concerning them, and causes us to regard them as conclusions only of our intellectual faculties. Both the causes and effects of these violent and calm passions are pretty variable, and depend, in a great measure, on the peculiar temper and disposition of every individual. Generally speaking, the violent passions have a more powerful influence on the will, though it is often found that the calm ones, when corroborated by reflection, and seconded by resolution, are able to control them in their most furious movements. What makes this whole affair more uncertain is that a calm passion may easily be changed into a violent one, either by a change of temper, or of the circumstances and situation of the object, as by the borrowing of force from any attendant passion, by custom, or by exciting the imagination. Upon the whole, this struggle of passion and of reason, as it is called, diversifies human life, and makes men so different, not only from each other, but also from themselves in different times. Philosophy can only account for a few of the greater and more sensible events of this war, but must leave all the smaller and more delicate revolutions, as dependent on principles too fine and minute for her Comprehension. Sect. X of the direct passions. It is easy to observe that the passions, both direct and indirect, are founded on pain and pleasure, and that in order to produce an affection of any kind, it is only requisite to present some good or evil. Upon the removal of pain and pleasure, there immediately follows a removal of love and hatred, pride and humility, desire and aversion, and of most of our reflective or secondary impressions, the impressions which arise from good and evil most naturally, and with the least preparation, are the direct passions of desire and aversion, grief and joy, hope and fear, along with volition. The mind by an original instinct tends to unite itself with the good, and to avoid the evil, though they be conceived merely in idea, and be considered as to exist in any future period of time. But supposing that there is an immediate impression of pain or pleasure, and that arising from an object related to ourselves or others, this does not prevent the propensity or aversion, with the consequent emotions, but by concurring with certain dormant principles of the human mind, excites the new impressions of pride or humility, love or hatred. That propensity, which unites us to the object, or separates us from it, still continues to operate, but in conjunction with the indirect passions, which arise from a double relation of impressions and ideas. These indirect passions, being always agreeable or uneasy, give in their turn additional force to the direct passions, and increase our desire and aversion to the object. Thus a suit of fine clothes produces pleasure from their beauty, and this pleasure produces the direct passions, or the impressions of volition and desire. Again, when these clothes are considered as belonging to ourself, the double relation conveys to us the sentiment of pride, which is an indirect passion, and the pleasure which attends that passion returns back to the direct affections, and gives new force to our desire or volition, joy or hope. When good is certain or probable, it produces joy. When evil is in the same situation, there arises grief or sorrow. When either good or evil is uncertain, it gives rise to fear or hope, according to the degrees of uncertainty on the one side or the other. Desire arises from good considered simply, and aversion is derived from evil. The will exerts itself when either the good or the absence of the evil may be attained by any action of the mind or body. Beside good and evil, or in other words, pain and pleasure, the direct passions frequently arise from a natural impulse or instinct, which is perfectly unaccountable. Of this kind is the desire of punishment to our enemies, and of happiness to our friends, hunger, lust, and a few other bodily appetites. These passions, properly speaking, produce good and evil, and proceed not from them. Like the other affections, none of the direct affections seem to merit our particular attention, except hope and fear, which we shall here endeavor to account for. It is evident that the very same event, which by its certainty would produce grief or joy, gives always rise to fear or hope, when only probable and uncertain. In order, therefore, to understand the reason why this circumstance makes such a considerable difference, we must reflect on what I have already advanced in the preceding book concerning the nature of probability. Probability arises from an opposition of contrary chances or causes, by which the mind is not allowed to fix on either side, but is incessantly tossed from one to another, and at one moment is determined to consider an object as existent, and at another moment as the contrary. The imagination or understanding, call it which you please, fluctuates betwixt the opposite views, and though perhaps it may be oftener turned to the one side than the other, it is impossible for it, by reason of the opposition of causes or chances, to rest on either. The pro and con of the question alternately prevail, in the mind, surveying the object in its opposite principles, finds such a contrariety as utterly destroys all certainty and established opinion. Suppose, then, that the object, concerning whose reality we are doubtful, is an object either of desire or aversion. It is evident that, according as the mind turns itself either to the one side or the other, it must feel a momentary impression of joy or sorrow. An object, whose existence we desire, gives satisfaction, when we reflect on those causes which produce it, and for the same reason excites grief or uneasiness from the opposite consideration. So that as the understanding, in all probable questions, is divided betwixt the contrary points of view, the affections must in the same manner be divided betwixt opposite emotions. Now if we consider the human mind, we shall find that with regard to the passions, it is not the nature of a wind instrument of music, which, in running over all the notes immediately loses the sound after the breath ceases, but rather resembles a string instrument, whereafter each stroke the vibrations still retain some sound, which gradually and insensibly decays. The imagination is extreme quick and agile, but the passions are slow and restive, for which reason, when any object is presented that affords a variety of views to the one, and emotions to the other, though the fancy may change its views with great celerity, each stroke will not produce a clear and distinct note of passion, but the one passion will always be mixed and confounded with the other, according as the probability inclines to good or evil. The passion of joy or sorrow predominates in the composition, because the nature of probability is to cast a superior number of views or chances on one side, or, which is the same thing, a superior number of returns of one passion, or since the dispersed passions are collected into one, a superior degree of that passion. That is, in other words, the grief and joy being intermingled with each other, by means of the contrary views of the imagination, produce by their union the passions of hope and fear. Upon this head there may be started a very curious question concerning that contrariety of passions, which is our present subject. It is observable that where the objects of contrary passions are presented at once, beside the increase of the predominant passion, which has been already explained, and commonly arises at their first shock or rencounter, it sometimes happens that both the passions exist successively, and by short intervals sometimes, that they destroy each other, and neither of them takes place, and sometimes that both of them remain united in the mind. It may, therefore, be asked, by what theory we can explain these variations, and to what general principle we can reduce them. When the contrary passions arise from objects entirely different, they take place alternately. The want of relation in the ideas separating the impressions from each other, and preventing their opposition. Thus when a man is afflicted for the loss of a lawsuit, and joyful for the birth of a son, the mind running from the agreeable to the calamitous object, with whatever celerity it may perform this motion, can scarcely temper the one affection with the other, and remain betwixt them in a state of indifference. It more easily attains that calm situation, when the same event is of a mixed nature, and contains something adverse and something prosperous. in its different circumstances. For in that case, both the passions, mingling with each other by means of the relation, become mutually destructive, and leave the mind in perfect tranquility. But suppose, in the third place, that the object is not a compound of good or evil, but is considered as probable or improbable in any degree. In that case I assert that the contrary passions will both of them be present at once in the soul, and instead of destroying and tempering each other, will subsist together, and produce a third impression, or affection by their union. Contrary passions are not capable of destroying each other, except when their contrary movements exactly rencounter, and are opposite in their direction, as well as in the sensation they produce. This exact rencounter depends upon the relations of those ideas from which they are derived, and is more or less perfect, according to the degrees of the relation. In the case of probability, the contrary chances are so far related that they determine concerning the existence or non-existence of the same object. But this relation is far from being perfect, since some of the chances lie on the side of existence, and others on that of non-existence, which are objects altogether incompatible. It is impossible by one steady view to survey the opposite chances, and the events dependent on them, but it is necessary that the imagination should run alternately from the one to the other. Each view of the imagination produces its peculiar passion, which decays away by degrees, and is followed by a sensible vibration. After the stroke, the incompatibility of the views keeps the passions from shocking in a direct line, if that expression may be allowed, and yet their relation is sufficient to mingle their fainter emotions. It is after this manner that hope and fear arise from the different mixture of these opposite passions of grief and joy, and from their imperfect union and conjunction. Upon the whole, contrary passions succeed each other alternately. When they arise from different objects, they mutually destroy each other. When they proceed from different parts of the same, and they subsist, both of them, and mingle together. When they are derived from the contrary and incompatible chances or possibilities, on which any one object depends, the influence of the relations of ideas is plainly seen. In this whole affair, if the objects of the contrary passions be totally different, the passions are like two opposite liquors in different bottles, which have no influence on each other. If the objects be intimately connected, the passions are like an alkali and an acid, which, being mingled, destroy each other. If the relation be more imperfect, and consist in the contradictory views of the same object, the passions are like oil and vinegar, which, however mingled, never perfectly unite and incorporate. As the hypothesis concerning hope and fear carries its own evidence, along with it, we shall be the more concise in our proofs. A few strong arguments are better than many weak ones. The passions of fear and hope may arise when the chances are equal on both sides, and no superiority can be discovered in the one above the other. Nay, in this situation the passions are rather the strongest, as the mind has then the least foundation to rest upon, and is tossed with the greatest uncertainty. Throw in a superior degree of probability to the side of grief, you immediately see that passion diffuse itself over the composition, and tincture it into fear. Increase the probability, and by that means the grief. The fear prevails still more and more, till at last it runs insensibly, as the joy continually diminishes, into pure grief. After you have brought it to this situation, diminished the grief after the same manner that you increased it by diminishing k probability on that side, and you'll see the passion clear every moment, until it changes insensibly into hope, which again runs, after the same manner, by slow degrees, into joy, as you increase that part of k composition by the increase of the probability. Are not these as plain proofs that the passions of fear